What's going down, everybody, and welcome back to another CAD Pop Patreon Deck Tech. This week, Rakdos, Lord of Riots. Let's hit it right now. Alright, and we are back for another CAD Pop Patreon Deck Tech brought to you by the Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/CADPopcast, where you can check out the reward tiers like having your deck featured on the YouTube channel, and FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all of your gaming needs. And today, your Rakdos, Lord of Riots artifact recycling needs. This is a deck sent in by my friend John, who contributes and is part of Gemstone Mine podcast. You can head on over. I'll put a little link to their content in the corner of this video, so you can click on that and give them a like and subscribe and go check out some of their stuff. I've received a few decks from John, and they all have their own little write-up, and he's got a bunch of his decks over there on his channel. This one, as per the email he sent me, isn't one that he's done yet. So we're going to take a look at it today. It's Rakdos, Lord of Riots, a 6/6 demon for red, black, black. Flying, trample. I just did this guy as one of the commanders on Commander ad Populum podcast for the Return to Ravnica set retrospective, where I talked about my version of Rakdos from years gone by. This is something completely different, but let's finish reading Rakdos first. You can't cast him unless an opponent lost life this turn, so that's why he's a 6/6 for 4. Quite a hefty drawback. We're going to see how we can make our way kind of around that. Also, creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. That's all life by all opponents. You play something that makes each opponent lose 1 life, and you have 3 opponents. All your creatures for the rest of the turn cost 3 less, 1 life for each opponent. So very powerful cost reducer. Before we get to the deck, keep in mind the Commander ad Populum deck techs are for 3 groups of people. The first group of people is the new players, new to the format or new to Magic the Gathering in general, and we're looking to learn some of the basics. What do we put in a deck? What do we play? How much of everything? Basic strategies. The second group of people are the players looking to maybe refine an edge or build outside a comfort zone, try something new. And then the third group of players are the long-time players looking for some nostalgia factor or maybe to build around a pet card. And I think today we're looking at groups 2 and 3. This is a little bit of a I'm going to say more intense deck. You have to politic a little bit harder. You have to weigh your options a little bit harder. And this deck is a fairly tuned deck. It does feature many expensive cards, and maybe this is the kind of deck where if you're a longtime player like myself or like some of the listeners out there like John, you've just got some of these cards and now you've finally got an excuse or a reason to play them because you can put them in your own Rakdos deck. So let's take a look at it. We don't have any custom categories today, so I'm going to start with the artifacts, and within the artifacts, I'm going to read the mana rocks first, and then we'll go to some of the other stuff. So we've got a Talisman of Indulgence, a Soul Ring, a Rakdos Signet, a Mox Opal, a Mox Diamond, a Lotus Petal, a Felwar Stone, a Chrome Mox, Bontu's Monument, which I'm going to count here because it does make black creature spells we cast cost 1 less. It also drains our opponent whenever we cast a creature spell, we gain a life. Maybe it's a way to cast Rakdos, maybe it's a way to go infinite. We're going to find out. We've got an Arcane Signet, those are the mana rocks, and then we've got a few sacrifice outlets, some of which give us some mana. We've got a Phyrexian Altar, and we've got a Krark Clan Ironworks. Notably here, no Ashnod's Altar. We're going to see if that comes into play, but these first 2 altars, we sacrifice creatures, or in Krark Clan Ironworks case, we sacrifice an artifact and we get mana. We've also got an Altar of Dementia, which is a sacrifice outlet that lets us mill target player's library for a number of cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. So we're going to see if some way, shape, or form we're going to mill us, or we're going to mill our opponents, or if we're going to do both. Let's do the 2 enchantments. We'll get them out of the way because they both serve a similar function. We've got an Impact Tremors. It's a 2-drop enchantment, red 1. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent, which is important. We're going to play a creature, we're going to get some damage. That's going to allow us to cast Rakdos, and then Rakdos does actually see damage or life loss to opponents from before he entered the battlefield. So if we landed our Rakdos after we cast a creature for free, let's say, or ETB'd a creature for free, we can cast our Rakdos and then we can get a discount still because he's going to look at number of life points lost by all opponents. The second enchantment is Goblin Bombardment. Another 2-drop, you sack a creature and it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. That's going to allow us to get our creatures into our graveyard. Maybe we're going to trigger some stuff. Maybe we're going to get some cards back. We got to dig a little bit deeper still. Before we hit the actual creatures, all 34 of them, let's look at some instants and sorceries. These are going to smooth things out. We've got some tutors. They are partially like the mana rocks were, some of what drives the cost of the deck up. So let's get the tutors out of the way. We've got a Buried Alive, that's going to tutor to our graveyard. We've got a Faithless Looting, which might contribute to graveyard because that's actually a draw spell that makes us discard, and then we can draw and discard again when we flash it back. We've got a Gamble, which you tutor for a card and then you discard 1 at random. Maybe it'll discard to our graveyard, we can get those back later, maybe it'll put it right into our hand. Notably, if Gamble's the last card in your hand and you tutor, then you have to discard the card you just tutored for. That might be something that you want to do. Then we've got a Demonic Tutor, a Diabolic Intent, which is Demonic Tutor, but you have to sacrifice a creature. Imperial Seal, which is a sorcery speed, search for anything, lose 2 life. This is like a $750 card, so take that with a grain of salt. And then a Living Death, our first reanimation spell. This is a mass reanimation one where for 5 mana, sorcery speed, each player essentially swaps the creatures that are in play with the creatures that are in their graveyard. So we've already seen a couple ways or a couple things that are suggesting that we want creatures to hit our graveyard. Now we've seen a way to maybe get them all back. And if we're actively trying to do this, like black decks sometimes want to do, we're going to take advantage of this more than our opponents are going to in most circumstances. And if we get a bad draw, bad game, bad hand, what have you, and we can't take advantage of this, most likely our opponents still aren't going to be able to take advantage of Living Death, and it kind of acts like a black sweeper. So it serves multiple functions. Great card. I actually really like this card. Moving over to the instance, we've got a couple more card draw spells, a couple more tutors. Let's take a look. We've got Village Rites and Costly Plunder. These are both card draw spells that want us to sacrifice a creature as an additional cost. Again, we're sacrificing a creature. Costly Plunder actually wants us to sacrifice a creature or an artifact. We're going to see if that's relevant in a couple minutes when we hit the actual creatures. Notably, I don't see a Great Furnace or a Vault of Whispers, which are artifact lands that you could sacrifice to Costly Plunder in a pinch. That is a little trick that I've done in the past when I've ran Costly Plunder, and I think that those would be welcome additions in the deck because we are playing 8 swamps, 4 mountains, a ton of non-basics that if they enter the battlefield tapped, like some of the ones that we're playing do, maybe we don't want those just because this deck is supposed to go fast. Anyways, moving on. We've got Entomb, which is another card that tutors a card to our graveyard, any card. We've got a Vampiric Tutor, another expensive tutor at $65. So again, take this with a grain of salt. And now I'm starting to see, maybe this deck is a little bit higher powered. Maybe this is a deck that wants to try and get in on the fringes of CEDH because I see a Pyroblast and a Red Elemental Blast and a Deflecting Swat. These are all cards that are mainstays in red inclusive CEDH decks. Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast both counter blue spells or destroy blue permanents. By and large, that's what they do. I'm not going to go into the subtle differences here. And then Deflecting Swat is if you control your commander, you can actually cast it for free. Very powerful card that allows you to choose new targets for target spell or ability. So if somebody goes to counter your thing or destroy your commander or maybe remove a combo piece, and we're tapped out, if we have Rakdos on the battlefield, we can just Deflecting Swat, move it somewhere else, maybe to a blocker, maybe to one of our opponent's combo pieces or a key enchantment that's helping them draw cards or make mana or what have you, and we can kill that and continue doing our own game plan. This seems like a fairly progressive deck. It wants to be the aggressor, actively trying to move towards killing people instead of setting up some shields, denying resources, what have you. And that is sort of, from my understanding, a common type of deck in a more competitive meta. There is decks, the functional equivalent of a fastball in baseball. It's going to predicate the game. This is what's happening, and other people have to try to defend against this deck. I like this kind of deck. But we've rushed through a bunch of it. Let's get to the creatures. And remember, there's 34 of them, so we're going to kind of have to both summarize them and kind of wrap our head around what they're all doing together. And they all cost not very much mana at all, with the exception of maybe a Sandstone Oracle, which is a card draw creature that when it ETBs, you draw cards equal to the difference between yours and the player with the most cards' hand. And then there's a Harvester of Souls, which is whenever a non-token creature dies, we draw a card. Both of the expensive creatures, there's one more actually, both of the expensive creatures so far have been card draw, so we know card draws at a premium. That's probably why we're running those 14 mana rocks that are almost $1,100 as a means to be able to ramp out, tutor for and ramp out those card draw spells. If we naturally drew them, of course, because we're running lots of card draw, we're probably going to use our tutors to find our combo creatures or our combo artifacts, that Phyrexian Altar or that Kark Clan Ironworks, and that's how we're going to further our win. But our third expensive creature, before we get to the rest of them, is a creature called Metalwork Colossus. This is a 10/10 for 11, costs X less to cast, where X is the total converted mana cost among non-creature artifacts you control, which is okay, fine. Most of our mana rocks and non-creature artifacts don't cost very much, so we're going to get only a little bit of a cost reduction. But remember, if we've done any damage, we're going to get a bunch of cost reduction from our commander, which is important. And then you can sacrifice 2 artifacts to return Metalwork Colossus from your graveyard to your hand. And if we've got 11 or more cost reduction on the battlefield, this does allow us to sacrifice Metalwork Colossus itself along with another artifact, and then we can target it in our graveyard. So this could make an infinite loop, which is our first one, provided we have 11 or more cost reduction, and or we've got some ways to maybe sacrifice this instead of to its own ability to a mana artifact like the Kark Clan Ironworks, like the Phyrexian Altar, or we use a subtle Aristocrat package like what's in this deck to generate treasures when this dies. So let's look at the Aristocrats right now. We've got Azulaport Cutthroat. I'm going to include Reckless Fireweaver. Artifact ETBs, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. We're going to count that today as an Aristocrat. We've got a Perforos. Creature enters the battlefield under your control. Each opponent takes 2. We're going to count that as an Aristocrat. Pitiless Plunderer. This is when a creature dies, we're going to get a treasure. We're going to count that as an Aristocrat. Nettle Drone. We're going to count this as an Aristocrat. Whenever we cast a colorless spell, we untap it, and we can tap it to deal 1 damage to each opponent. This on turn 3, tap it to deal 3 damage among all your opponents, is going to put our Rakdos onto the battlefield with a cost reducer of 3 on turn 4. Very good. And if we could do like a Nettle Drone on turn 2, Rakdos on 3, even better. But we're going to continue. We've got a Judith the Scourge Diva, another one that's going to drain our opponents when creatures die. Goblin Sharpshooter, 1 damage, but every time a 1/1 dies, we untap Goblin Sharpshooter. So first of all, it kills all the 1 toughness creatures that our opponents control, because every time a creature dies, you untap it, but then we can tap it to deal a damage to an opponent and then infinitely sacrifice something like our Metalwork Colossus and infinitely get it back and cast it again, and it's going to infinitely untap Goblin Sharpshooter. We're going to keep going on this train, though. We've got Goblin Fireslinger, Flare Drone, Dross Scorpion, Disciple of the Vault. That's an Aristocrat, but only for artifacts. And finally, Blood Artist, the OG. Whenever Blood Artist or another creature dies, Target player loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. So quite the stout Aristocrat package for doing loops. But wait, there's more. How else are we going to do loops besides an 11 drop that functionally doesn't work if we don't have our commander or some of our fast mana was turned off? Well, just you wait. We've got what I want to call is a little bit of a scrap trawler package. And when I say scrap trawler, I could also mean junk diver, or I could also mean mirror retriever. There's a few of these that when they die, they bring an artifact from your graveyard back to your hand. So remember, we've got the sacrifice outlets. We've got a few of these cards, the junk divers, the scrap trawlers, that when they die, we get stuff back. And when you sacrifice those and get the other version, let's say you sacrifice your junk diver to get your mirror retriever back, and you can cast both for free, those are going to enter and leave the battlefield an infinite number of times. And if they cost you 0 mana, you're netting something. You're netting colorless mana if you're sacrificing to Krark-Clan Ironworks. You're netting colored mana if you sacrifice to Phyrexian Altar. There's all sorts of loops like that, and there's all sorts of secondary and auxiliary creatures that you can use, or cards that you can use to further this strategy. And I really like it because Aristocrats typically is like a mono black thing, or it might be a black white thing, but today it's a black red thing. And when you look at what are typical Rakdos Lord of Riots lists, you see big creatures, you see Eldrazi tribal, but today we keep it low, we keep it close to the ground. This a little bit follows suit with the efficiency race, or the strive for low mana value things to make decks fast, to make them compete with the best decks in the format. And I love how I haven't even mentioned some of the cards yet. Cards like Dockside Extortionist, Goblin Engineer, Goblin Welder. These are mainstays in red inclusive CEDH decks. We're using them in different ways. So instead of finding traditional CEDH pieces with your Goblin Engineer or your Goblin Welder that actually let you switch cards from graveyards and libraries, what you might want to get back is something like a Filigree Familiar that actually gains you life when it enters a battlefield, and when it dies, you draw a card. So another just kind of loopable card draw thing that's going to allow you to draw your whole engine and act sort of like a tutor. Great stuff, cool stuff. I didn't read all of the creatures because at some point you just run into so much redundancy that it's kind of hard to listen to, but they'll all be on the screen. If you're listening to the audio version of this, I would encourage you, head on over to Commander Ad Populum on YouTube, find the Rakdos video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel. Keep in mind, not all decks on this channel are going to be CEDH Fringe or CEDH Lite. They're not all going to be $3,400 decks. We do focus on teaching. We do focus on learning. We do focus on keeping Magic affordable and having Magic kind of be an outlet for creativity, because we don't all have the means to do the $3,400 deck. We don't have the collection. Some people don't like proxying, or they play in groups that aren't okay with proxying. So keep that in mind. We're not always going to do the $3,400 deck. I should mention 34 land in the deck. The total for those 34 land is almost $1,100 as well. I see Arid Mesa, Badlands, Blood Crypt, Bloodstained Mire, Fabled Passage, Mana Confluence, City of Brass, Wooded Foothills, Verdant Catacombs. Of course, these are dual lands, fetch lands, any color lands that deal damage to you, and these all see play across a myriad of types of decks, strategies, across different formats, all the way back into Legacy and Vintage. So that's why those cards are expensive. And keep in mind, you don't have to play those. You don't have to. You could substitute that Badlands and the Arid Mesa and the Wooded Foothills. You could substitute those for basics. You could substitute those for Urborg, Tomb to Yawgmoth if you had that. I know that's a $20-some card, but it's not a $520 card like a Badlands. So just little tweaks like that are going to allow you to play a deck like this that aren't going to be $3,400. I should mention as well that John's deck does include a bunch of foils, so this must be the actual deck that he plays with foils denoted. maybe he's working towards a fully pimped deck where everything is foil, so that is going to drive the price up as well. And of course, you don't need foils to play Commander. It's not required. It's just a nice thing to have, and it's a nice thing to denote when you're showing off the deck like on the channel. So big thanks to John. I would encourage everybody to check out Gemstone Mine podcast, wherever you get your podcasts or wherever they're found. You can search them online. You can find them on YouTube. Head over, give them a subscribe, follow them on Twitter. I'm sure you can find all their socials in any of the show notes for anything that you consume their content on any platform. And if you want to find me, I'm at CADPopcast on Twitter, Commander at Populum Facebook page. You can send me a DM there or on Twitter. DMs are open everywhere. If you have a Magic adjacent topic that affects lives in positive ways, you use Magic to help people, Magic's helped you, anything special like that you want to share, a little bit longer form or private or more private than Twitter, cadpopcast@gmail.com. Final couple thanks go to FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all of your Rakdos Lord of Riots needs. You can head on over. If you sell them stuff or if you pick up anything from the deck we talked about today, make sure you leave them a little note at checkout that Ryan from Commander at Populum sent you. It helps the show out a lot. And finally, if you want to get your deck featured, head on over to patreon.com/cadpopcast. Huge thanks to all the patrons. You guys make it possible for me. Couldn't make the show, neither the podcast or the YouTube channel, without you guys. The equipment, the hosting, the bandwidth, all of the stuff that it takes to kind of raise a podcast and raise a YouTube channel. It's all because of all of the support that I receive, patrons or otherwise, and I very much do appreciate it. That's it for today, everybody. I will see you next Wednesday.